Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Amateur Radio General Class, session number 15. During our previous session, we had a question pool review. We looked at the quarter wave ground plane antenna. We looked at the concept of ground mounted radials. We discussed the quarter wave antenna feed point impedance. We also looked at some directional antennas. We discussed the concept of antenna gain and its measurements in dBi and dBd. We also considered the front to back ratio concept. We had a look at the Yagi antenna. We looked at stacking of Yagi antennas. We also discussed the gamma match as well as the hairpin match, and we also had a look at quad antennas. So this is where we are in our curriculum. We are coming to the end of antenna feed lines, and today we will just start off a bit on the radio wave propagation topic. So again, a reminder, you can always take practice exams at any time, build your confidence, see how you're doing. And we did have one question that was unanswered from the last class. I think we answered a couple of them live during the session, but there was one coming towards the end of the session that we left for today's Q&A. So the question is, if you have two tri-banda antennas, for example, 10 meter, 15 meter, 20 meter, and that's 28 megahertz, 21 megahertz, and 14 megahertz respectively, can you stack them, and what vertical distance should be used? So that's a very good question. Well, the first part of the answer is yes, you certainly can stack HF tri-banda antennas. However, unless you have some sort of mechanized means on a very long tower, you will have to choose one distance that will apply to one of the particular bands. So that choice will probably be based on most let's say the height of the antenna tower that you're using. Because if the antenna tower is not high enough and you cannot have that vertical separation, then it can't occur. So it's really, you will have to use the appropriate length of tower, and then you choose which one of them that you would like to. And it's probably most likely based on the band that is most important to you or most used. So that's the best answer. And of course, if anyone in the class would like to offer another answer to that question, feel free so to do. So we continue. We will now look at the question pool in relation to the theory we discussed in our previous session. Okay, so we are now on our no-nonsense guide, and we are on page 42 if you're following on the PDF version. If you're following on the book version, you'll have to adjust to the page number. So let's go straight into the questions in the question pool. So our first question is, which of the following best describes the radiation pattern of a quarter wave ground plane vertical antenna? So dissecting this question, they're asking us for the radiation pattern. That's what we are looking for as an answer. But for what type of antenna? Quarter wave vertical. So we learned last class that quarter wave vertical, horizontally or in azimuth, which is you just turn your head left to right all around, it's 360, which is omnidirectional in azimuth. Next question in the question pool. What is the approximate length for a quarter wave antenna cut for 28.5 megahertz? So let's dissect this question. What are they asking us for? They're asking us to calculate the length of an antenna. But what kind of antenna? A quarter wave, not a half wave, a quarter wave vertical. And what frequency are we looking to calculate that length for? 28.5 megahertz. So we use our trusty magic formula for quarter wave, not for half wave, which is L is equal to 234 over the frequency. And when we plug that into our trusty calculator, we get approximately 8 feet. Again, we did this as a work example in the last class. Next question in the question pool. Where should the radial wires of a ground-mounted vertical antenna be placed? So last class via the diagram, on the surface of the earth or buried but just a few inches below the ground. Okay, remember we said not too deep. Okay, and that's for a ground-mounted antenna. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following is a common way to adjust the feed point impedance of a quarter wave ground plane vertical antenna to be approximately 50 ohms? Let's dissect this question. So what are they asking us about? They're asking us about adjusting the feed point impedance. How do we adjust the feed point impedance? And we learned that for the quarter wave ground plane, all we need to do is to slope the radials downward. So that's the answer. Moving right along, next question. Which HF antenna would be the best to use for minimizing interference? So what we said last session when we looked at directional antennas, we said one of the advantages of directional antennas, if we're getting interference from a particular direction, if we were to use a directional antenna, we could point the antenna away from the source of interference. So that's the answer that they're looking for, a directional antenna. Next question. What is meant by the terms dBi and dBd when referring to antenna gain? Okay, so they're asking us for the meaning of dBi and dBd. So we know dB is decibel, right? So the answer, as we learned last class, dBi is dB with respect to an isotropic antenna. Remember that ideal doesn't really exist in real world antenna, that isotropic antenna. And dBd, that last D, refers to the dipole antenna. So that's dBi, dBd. Next question. How does antenna gain stated in dBi compared to gain stated in dBd for the same antenna? So we had said, some manufacturers use that as a marketing gimmick, a trick. They will give you the antenna gain in dBi because it is higher than dBd. But by how much? We said that compared, dBi gain figures are 2.15 dB higher than dBd gain figures. So again, don't be fooled. When you get a gain listed on the specs of an antenna, ask, is it dBi or dBd? Compare apples and apples, right? Next question. What does front to back ratio mean in reference to a Yagi antenna? So we had a nice diagram and we said that it shows that the power radiated in the major radiation lobe compared to the power radiated in exactly the opposite direction. That's what front to back ratio means with the Yagi. Next question. What is meant by the main lobe of a directive antenna? So we had a diagram up and we showed that the main lobe is the direction of maximum radiated field strength from the antenna. In other words, that's where you're sending the signal from the antenna towards. That direction, that's the main lobe. Next question in the question pool. So a little errata here. They forgot to say question before the question, but that's all right. Errors do happen. What is the approximate length of the driven element of a Yagi antenna? So we learned that that driven element is calculated at half wavelength of whatever the operating frequency is. Next question. How do the lengths of a 3-element Yagi reflector and director compare to that of the driven element? Okay, so let's dissect this question a little bit. You may recall that a Yagi antenna has a couple of components. We talked about the boom, that's the foundation of the antenna really to hold everything together. There's the driven element or the main element that's radiating the signal. That's where your feed line comes and connects via the feed point 2. But you also have elements before and after that. So you have the director and you have the reflector. Okay, so they're asking us, how does the length of the director compare? how does the length of the reflector compare? So we have learned that the reflector, which is at the back, is longer. You might remember we said by 5%. And the director, the first director anyway, is 5% shorter. So that's the answer. Reflector is longer, the director is shorter. So it's like a pencil point. Remember we said that? The direction, as it gets shorter, that's the direction you're pointing towards. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following would increase the bandwidth of a Yagi antenna? So we said that the bandwidth of the antenna is the frequency range that it is resonant across. And we did have a question last session about what can we do. And what we can do, we can go with larger diameter elements. In other words, we can go with a thicker element or a larger type of conduit or a larger type of, let's say we're using aluminum as the element. We can use larger diameter elements. So that's how we increase the bandwidth. How does increasing boom length and adding directors affect a Yagi antenna? So we said the boom was that structural part that holds the antenna together. What happens when we increase that? And what happens when we add additional directors? Remember the whole idea of putting the reflector, the director, and so on is to have gain and directivity. Right, so when we add directors and we increase the boom length, the gain of the antenna increases. We get more gain. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following can be adjusted to optimize forward gain, front to back ratio, or SWR bandwidth of a Yagi antenna? So we dealt with this the last session. We said that to do these things, we can, the physical length of the boom, we can adjust that. We can also adjust the number of elements on the boom. In other words, the number of directors, we can add more. And the spacing of each element along the boom. If we adjust that and shift that, we can achieve these requirements. So all of these choices or all of these answers are correct for that question. Moving right along. How does the gain of two 3-element horizontally polarized Yagi antennas spaced vertically half wavelength apart typically compare to the gain of a single 3-element Yagi? Okay, long-winded question, but let's dissect it. Let's break it apart. What are they asking us? They're asking us to compare. But compare what? Two 3-element Yagis, right, versus one 3-element Yagi. But the two of them that they're talking about are spaced vertically half wavelength apart. And as we learned in last class, that is called stacking. So what they're asking us about, what happens when you stack two 3-element Yagi antennas versus one? How do they compare? Well, we're doing it for gain. And how is the gain affected? Well, when you stack them, we said that you double the power, you get approximately 3 dB higher. That's the gain of two 3-element stacked Yagis compared to just one. Next question in the question pool. What is an advantage of vertically stacking of horizontally polarized Yagi? So similar question. Apart from gain, it also narrows the main lobe in elevation. So those are the things or what occurs when you stack or vertically stack horizontally polarized Yagi antennas. Next question in the question pool. Which of the following is an advantage of using a gamma match with a Yagi antenna? So remember, we said what a gamma match was. We said we use it to tune the antenna. But there's an advantage of using that gamma match. And it has the property such that it does not require that the driven element be insulated from the boom. Okay, you don't have to insulate it from the boom. So that's the advantage of a gamma match. So now they're asking us, what is a beta or hairpin match. So just remember that you can use these two terms to describe that type of match that we looked at. It's either called a beta match or a hairpin match. What is it? Well, we defined what it was. It is a shorted transmission line stub placed at the feed point of a Yagi antenna to provide impedance matching. So that's the definition. We also showed what it actually looked like. So when you look at it, you will see the definition in front of you. Okay, moving right along. Approximately how long is each side of the driven element of a quad antenna? We had showed what that looked like, and we said that each side is quarter wavelength long. Moving right along. What configuration of the loops of a 2-element quad antenna must be used for the antenna to operate as a beam antenna, assuming one of the elements is used as a reflector? Okay, so we said that that reflector must be about 5% longer than the driven element. So that's what they're looking for in that question. For it to be a reflector, it must be measured and cut at approximately 5% longer than the driven element for it to operate as a directional or beam antenna. Next question. How does the forward gain of a 2-element quad compare to the forward gain of a 3-element Yagi antenna? So let's dissect this question. They're asking us to compare. What are we comparing? We are comparing the forward gain. But the forward gain of what? Of a 2-element quad compared to a 3-element Yagi. And last class, we actually compared those, and we said that the gain of a 2-element quad is about the same as that of a 3-element Yagi. So 2-element quad, about the same as a 3-element Yagi. So that's the answer. The gain is about the same. Okay. So let's go right back now to our slide deck. All right. So let's do some theory. So we're talking antennas still, and we are now looking at an antenna called the inverted V. So we have up on the screen a diagram to show how it looks like, how it's constructed. But we have also put it next to another antenna that you have seen to compare and contrast. So on the left-hand side of the diagram, you see the dipole antenna that we came across already. Should look familiar. Our feed line and our legs, feed point. But we also have the inverted V next to it. And notice the similarity. You have the feed line going to the center feed point, and then you have the two legs. But notice the difference between the two. So we say that the inverted V antenna is actually a variation of the half-wave dipole. It's very similar, but we install it differently. The inverted V antenna has a central support. Notice here, we are centrally supporting the antenna, so therefore the elements actually slope downwards. Whereas with the dipole, we're actually supporting it at the ends like this, and it's horizontal. So the inverted V, it actually looks like an inverted letter V. So this is what you need to know for your exam. It's an antenna that has a single central support. Another type of antenna, the horizontal loop. A little bit more complicated, but nonetheless, we have our picture to illustrate what it looks like. So this is our horizontal loop. It's horizontally placed in space. And the distance, or the length rather, of this antenna is at least one wavelength for the frequency of operation, or as we say, the lowest operating frequency. So when you're constructing the antenna, you need to construct it to at least one wavelength. And you'll see here that how it's installed or constructed here, you see each side of it is quarter wavelength long. So the total is at least one wavelength. And this is what the horizontal loop antenna looks like. And you have your feed line going up to it and so on. And this is your house or your ham shack. So that's what it looks like. But we also need to know the radiation pattern of the horizontal loop antenna. So I have here a comparison of the radiation pattern of the dipole and the actual horizontal loop antenna. And we said that for the horizontal loop antenna, the combination of the vertical and horizontal polarization is virtually omnidirectional. So notice here, it's omnidirectional, 360. Your radiation goes out equally about in all directions horizontally. Okay? So omnidirectional horizontal pattern. And we also saying that we have a lower peak vertical radiation. So if you were to look at the dipole, and this is in comparison to the dipole, notice the dipole vertical radiation is kind of a high peak. So relatively speaking, notice here for the horizontal loop, there is a peak, but it's a little rounder or flatter. So that's what they mean, and that's, you actually get that as a question in the question pool. That's what they mean by a lower peak vertical radiation angle than a dipole. So just to illustrate, this is a higher peak vertical radiation, and for this one, you kind of have a lower peak vertical radiation compared to the dipole. And this is what you need to know for your exam. Just some extra information. This horizontal loop antenna can actually be used on multiple bands, but you would need to use an antenna tuner. So those, if you want to know, yes, you can just use an antenna tuner and you can have it for multiple bands. Okay. We come to another type of antenna now called the log periodic antenna. And we have a diagram showing it here. And if you say, but wait a minute, it's kind of looking Yagi-ish. You know, it's looking kind of like a Yagi, right? You would be sort of correct. Yeah, there's a resemblance to a Yagi, but it has a fundamental difference. So it resembles the Yagi. So that means it's directional. Okay? So we say here that the log periodic antenna, that's what this antenna is on the right-hand side, is a directional antenna, similar to the Yagi, and it can be used on multiple bands. So note that. Once you hear log periodic antenna, it's designed for use on multiple bands. For the exam, you need to know that the element length and the spacing vary according to the log along the boom. So for instance, what do we mean by that? Notice here we have the element lengths. This is one element here. This is another element. Notice we're getting shorter and shorter. And notice here that we have the distance or the spacing between the elements. Notice that it's varying. So we have this distance here. Notice this distance is actually shorter. This distance is actually shorter. This distance is shorter, and so on. So the elements are getting progressively shorter, and the distance between the elements are getting progressively shorter, and logarithmically actually along the boom. So that's what this means here, what we just said. Element length and spacing vary logarithmically along the boom. So you need to know that for your exam. Compared to a Yagi, it has a very wide bandwidth, but lower gain. So what do we mean by that? Remember we said that it can be used on several bands. So that means you have a lot of good bandwidth, meaning that you have resonance and low SWR across a wider range of frequencies. But compared to a Yagi, the gain, pound for pound, is actually lower than a Yagi. So you get gain, yes, you get directivity and gain, just like a Yagi, but just not as much gain. But the beauty about the log periodic antenna compared to a Yagi is the bandwidth. Remember we said for the Yagi, you could increase the bandwidth by increasing the thickness of the element, the driven element. Well, with the log periodic antenna, you're increasing your bandwidth. A lot of bandwidth you're getting by this sort of log periodic calculation. And once you construct this type of antenna, you have gain and very wide bandwidth, which you need to know for your exam. Okay, so we come to another type of antenna, or concept really, called NVIS. NVIS. It stands for Near Vertical Incidence Skywave. NVIS. So it's a technique. So we say that the near vertical incidence skywave antennas usually consist of a horizontal dipole that's mounted close to the ground. So let's look at this diagram here first of all. So we'll notice that this is a dipole. We should be accustomed to what a dipole looks like. We have our feed line coming to the center here, and we have a leg on the right and a leg on the left, and that's a dipole. But it's mounted close to the ground. And what do we mean by close to the ground? Close vertically. So this is our ground here, ground area. We actually have some wires in the ground, but this is our ground. And this dipole is vertically close to the ground. It's not very high up. It's relatively close. But how close? Well, 1/10 to a quarter wavelength above. So whatever the frequency this antenna is cut for, and there are specific frequencies that you could really use NVIS for anyway, but whatever the frequency of operation that the antenna is cut for, the vertical distance is 1/10 of the wavelength of that frequency, or 1/10, as we say, 1/10 to quarter wave. All right, so anywhere between 1/10 to quarter wave distance, that's the height of the dipole is going to be. So you need to learn this for the exam, very important. But let's do some extra things as well as we are talking about NVIS, and then we'll go to a break. So on the right-hand side here, we show another construct. So even though we say NVIS antennas are usually a horizontal dipole, you can mount an NVIS antenna like this. So you will, in textbook and so on, you will see NVIS antennas that look like this as well. So just bear that in mind. Don't be worried if you see that. That's just another way you can construct the antenna. But what are we actually trying to achieve with an NVIS antenna? We say that that's what it is, just how it's constructed. But what are we actually trying to do? And what is NVIS about? What is the NVIS concept about? So we now come to the other two diagrams that we have here. So on HF, if I am in Trinidad and Tobago and I'm trying to talk to some long distance contact, I will use my regular antenna and I will have, a low angle of radiation. My signal will go bounce off the ionosphere, or it will really reflect or actually refract off of the ionosphere and drop to some long distance. But that's called the skip distance. But notice my signal is going all the way here. But what about if I wanted to talk to someone a little closer? My angle of radiation is low, a low takeoff angle with my standard antennas. And my signal will really go far across the world. But I really wanted to talk to somebody nearby, a short up within my skip zone, my skip distance. So what I do is I employ an NVIS antenna that will allow my signal to shoot upwards towards the ionosphere, literally upwards, up and away, at a high angle of radiation, a high takeoff angle. And when my signal goes more up like this, and it bounces or it reflects or really it refracts in the ionosphere and it comes down, it will drop shorter. And that may be what I want to do as a ham. I want to make my signal drop shorter so I can communicate with someone at a nearer distance. I'm not interested in communicating all around the world, maybe right here within the island, within the Caribbean. I want to have a short skip contact. So therefore what I do is I use the NVIS technique and cause my signal to have a high angle of radiation, and it will drop shorter compared to when I use a low angle of radiation or low takeoff angle. I will get very far, but I wouldn't get near. As a matter of fact, they probably won't hear me and I probably won't hear them. So I use NVIS as the technique to be able to communicate. So we say that NVIS antennas have a high angle of radiation due to ground reflection, and it allows the signal to bounce off the ionosphere at relatively short distances. But for your exam, you need to know the NVIS antenna is mounted usually 1/10 to quarter wavelength above the ground. So folks, well, before I do, let's just go to this other diagram here. Notice the NVIS, it bounces, and we're showing that it actually bounces off the earth and bounces again off the ionosphere, and you can have communication within the short skip region or the short distance region or the skip region. And if I am using a low angle of radiation, it will actually get me very far and long distance. So that's how hams communicate around the world without terrestrial infrastructure. We did that in the technician class. We showed that we bounce stuff off of stuff, and we take our signal, bounce it off the ionosphere, and have long-range communication. But we can also do bouncing in a way that it will drop short, and we use the NVIS technique or NVIS antennas to have our signal drop short for short distance communications. So folks, let us take a short break get a little stretch, maybe have a bathroom break, have some water, and we'll meet you back in 2 minutes time. Okay, everyone, welcome back. And we have a question from Avin. Avin asks, weren't NVIS used in air traffic control towers? So that's a good question. We'll attempt an answer, and I could do some research and get back to you. So I'm not aware that air traffic control towers use NVIS. I'm not sure if the acronym is what you're referring to or the concept of NVIS. Air traffic control towers, typically for those aircrafts in short range, will use the VHF system, which NVIS concept will not work. NVIS is really limited to the HF part of the spectrum. And for that, that is usually very long distance communications, because short range communications, normally they communicate, if they're doing radio, it will be via the VHF, AM VHF part of the spectrum for local contact and tower communications. So the antennas that I've seen, for example, in Trinidad and Tobago or Piaco, I've seen HF log periodic arrays. So I doubt it, but I could do some further research. So I'm not sure if the NVIS term, if you were thinking ILS for instrument landing system, or VOR, DME, or NDB, one of those that's used for guiding the aircraft and so on. But I'll take a look at it there, Arvin, and see if it is. But right now, my thinking is not really, because of the frequency that you have to use NVIS for and the distance of, right, exactly. Arvin, that same antenna outside of Carl's office, that's a log periodic antenna. That's the same antenna we're talking about. Yes, indeed. But that's log periodic. Cool. All right, so let's continue. Good question there. I'll do a little research, but my answer right now is I don't think so. All right. So, of course, if anyone else in the class has a view, feel free to pop it in or send an email, and we can all learn something. So there we go. So continuing, another type of antenna, beverage antenna. Yes, there's a beverage antenna. But what is a beverage antenna exactly? So, for instance, okay, so we have John saying here, air traffic control uses line of sight VHF, UHF radios. Yeah, so I agree with that there, John. So I highly doubt that NVIS is used by the towers at all. But, do a little research, but I do agree with you fully. That's what we have observed as well. So, Arvin, we have another person chiming in saying, yes, it's VHF, UHF they use, and NVIS is really for the HF part of the band. So, and a particular HF part of the band as well, too. So, yeah, so John says air traffic control uses line of sight, VHF, UHF. Yeah, cool. All right, John, thanks. And also NVIS is used for over-the-horizon HF radio comm. Thank you so much, John. Really appreciate your input as well. Fantastic. So we do have persons in the class with a lot of knowledge that we can all share and learn from. All right, so continuing. We have up on screen the antenna that's known as a beverage antenna. So we don't drink the antenna, we use the antenna, but it's really antenna, according to the theory that we're looking at, it's used primarily for receiving and on the HF band, and they say the low HF part of the band. And that's an exam question, so you'll need to learn it as they have it here. So beverage antennas, it's directional, and it's mainly used for receiving on the low HF part of the band. So we just have a little diagram here showing what a beverage antenna looks like. It's, notice how long this piece of wire is, and it's used for receiving. So you need to know this information here for your exam, what a beverage antenna is and what it's used for. Receiving and for the low HF part of the band. Okay, so we need to now discuss for multiband antennas, a concept called harmonic rejection. So let's go. So we say that multiband antennas are antennas that can be used on more than one band. So anytime you hear the term multiband antennas, you can use it on multiple bands. And quite often, it also kind of means that you could use it without a tuner, without much tuning. It can mean that. So that's, generally what multiband means. It's resonant on multiple bands. Although really and truly, some of the multiple bands you do need to use a tuner, but generally we're saying that multiband antennas are antennas that you could use on multiple bands. And we have an example here just to illustrate. We have been looking at a lot of aluminum type antennas and maybe some wire antennas as well. But just for information, the ZS6BKW, which is a optimized G5RV antenna. It's resonant on a couple of bands, 40 meters, 20 meters, 17 meters, 15 meters, 10 meters, and 6 meters. It can be this particular antenna. So this is a multiband antenna, for instance, and we have a diagram showing you how it's made up. You have the ladder line here, and then you have the wire dipole that's going off to either side of it. And this is a multiband antenna. It's resonant on multiple frequencies. But there's a disadvantage of multiband antennas, and that is it has poor harmonic rejection. But what is that? So we would have learned in the technician class that a harmonic is a multiple of a frequency. So if you have one frequency, you have harmonics, so that's a multiple of that frequency. You multiply by a number, you have the second harmonic, third harmonic, fourth harmonic, and this is what we're looking at here on the diagram. So whatever the frequency is, you multiply it and you get what the other frequency is. So the fifth harmonic is 5 times whatever the fundamental is, and so on. So what happens with a multiband antenna is that it might actually radiate unwanted harmonics. So you are trying to transmit on one frequency, but because your antenna is multiband, it might actually unintentionally radiate frequencies on the other bands that your antenna happens to be resonant on. So you need to learn that for the exam, that one disadvantage of a multiband antenna is poor harmonic rejection, meaning that harmonics may exist and harmonics may be emitted by your antenna because it's a multiband antenna as opposed to a single band antenna. So please learn this for your exam. So we now come to an antenna called the trap vertical. So we're going to spend a little time looking at this antenna and how it's constructed. But let's, with the definition. A trap vertical antenna is a type of multiband antenna, and it uses antenna traps. Those antenna traps are used to block specified frequencies to make the antenna appear shorter from an RF or radio frequency point of view. And we're just saying that those traps are actually comprised of LC circuits. Remember what an L and a C is? If you said coil or coil and capacitor, or inductor and capacitor, you would be quite correct. So we have, just to show you and remind you, all those components that we learned in the technician class and earlier in the general class, that's where it's coming together, because a trap is made up of something, and that something is a coil or an inductor and a capacitor. So the trap vertical antenna. So this antenna that we're seeing in the middle of our screen here is a vertical antenna, but it's a trap vertical because we have a couple of traps inside of there. So if this antenna happens to be an antenna that could be used, for instance, for 10 meters and 15 meters and 20 meters, we need 2 traps inside of there. What we really want in any antenna, we want our antenna to be resonant on the frequency that we use. Remember, we said that hams are matchmakers, so we need to match the frequency that we're going to use to make sure that the antenna is resonant. But how can one antenna be resonant on multiple frequencies? Well, we use something called traps, so that what it does, let's say here we are looking at this antenna that's it's long, it's 11 feet 1 inches. That's the length of the antenna, 3.38 meters. So that antenna will be resonant on a particular frequency. But if we were to think of the trap as a sort of shut-off valve, and we shut off that valve here, then the antenna is only this length. So we have this 10-meter trap here. So when this 10-meter trap is in force, basically the antenna is shortened, and it looks as though the length of the antenna is only from the base of the antenna to this point here, up to the 10-meter trap. So that antenna itself will appear to be this long for the purpose of that frequency. It will not know or it will not know that this part of the antenna exists. That is what the trap is doing. It is making the antenna appear shorter, not physically, but from a radio frequency standpoint. And then we have another trap here, 15-meter trap. So when we are on 15 meters and we're transmitting on 15 meters, this trap here, again, will work like a shut-off valve. And it will make the antenna look to only be from this length to here. The rest of the antenna doesn't exist from a radio frequency standpoint. So that's what the 15-meter trap does. And then when I go and I transmit on 20 meters, now I don't have a 20-meter trap. But the whole antenna is used for 20 meters. So let's take that again. So this is a tri-band vertical antenna that works on 10 meters, 15 meters, and 20 meters. But we have a 10-meter trap and we have a 15-meter trap. The 10-meter trap will work or come into play when I am transmitting on 10 meters. So the antenna actually looks shorter. It looks just from here to here. So as far as that frequency is concerned, this is the only part of the antenna that exists. When I go and transmit on 15 meters now, the frequency thinks, hey, my antenna is longer. It thinks that this is the antenna from this distance here to this distance here. That's the length of my antenna. So I'm resonant on 15 meters. But when I go on 20 meter and the 20-meter band and start to transmit, well, that frequency thinks that this is the entire antenna. It uses the entire length of the antenna. There's no trap needed. So that is what we mean by a trap vertical. It's a vertical antenna and it has these coil capacitor components inside of there. And on the right-hand side, we have a little bit of a construct what it actually looks like inside of one of these traps, just to give you an idea of how it's made up. We try to keep it real so that everyone can see what it physically looks like. But this is what the trap does. The trap basically it blocks frequencies to make the antenna appear shorter from an RF standpoint. And note that trap verticals are used for multiband operation. Okay, so, and Fran said, yes, many of them need tuners. So Ham's the matchmakers and we need to tune it. Good point there, Franz. All right, so let's talk about another type of antenna, the end-fed half-wave antenna. So again, we like to compare and contrast in the class. So we have a dipole antenna on the left-hand side. We are accustomed to what the dipole looks like. We have our feed line, and then we have our feed point, and then we have the leg on the left and the leg on the right. So that's our half-wave dipole, and each leg is actually quarter wavelength. So the full length is half-wave. But we also have an antenna where the feed point is down at the end and not in the middle. So the feed point for the dipole is snap dab in the middle of the antenna, but for an end-fed antenna, the feed point is actually at the end. It's not in the middle, it's at the end. Now, it's very easy to build an end-fed antenna. It basically is just literally a length of wire. It's very easy to install. You just go and find a high tree or someplace high and you stick it up there and you come down. And it's very useful for portable operation. You're going in the field and you need to throw up an antenna. You don't have to find a tower, you don't have to mount. You just find something that you can hook one end onto and then you come straight down to your feed line. So it's very easy. However, there's a disadvantage to the end-fed type of antenna. For the exam, you need to know that it has a very high feed point impedance. Remember we had said that in the theory earlier, when you move the feed point towards the end, the impedance increases. Well, there's the extreme where you put the feed point actually at the end, all the way to the end, and that's called an end-fed half-wave antenna. But the feed point is astronomically high. It's very high, and we wouldn't, well, several thousand ohms, right? Some books will tell you 1,500 to 8,000 ohms, but I wouldn't, venture a guess. It's variable depending on many things. What you need to know, it's very high. It's a big number, right? So, as Fran said earlier too, with respect to the vertical, you need a matching device to tune the antenna for low SWR. So for the exam, for this half-wave antenna that's end-fed, you need to know that the feed point impedance is very, very, very high. Okay, another antenna type. We come now to the magnetic loop antenna. So we have a diagram that shows how it's constructed, and we have actually another diagram to show what one actually looks like in practice. So this is called the magnetic loop antenna, and it's constructed using a relatively large coil or loop. This is our coil here. This right there, that's the loop. And it uses a capacitor. So see why we did these symbols and the components? We should recognize that this is a capacitor, but it has an arrow through it, meaning it's a variable capacitor or tuning capacitor. So the magnetic loop antenna, we have a coil with a capacitor for tuning and matching. The diameter of this coil is actually typically less than a third wavelength of the desired operating frequency, thereabouts, usually less than 1/3 wavelength. So it's a fairly compact antenna for the frequency that you're going to use. But for the exam, we need to know about the radiation pattern of this magnetic loop antenna. And the radiation pattern, when you transmit, or receive as well, but when you're transmitting from this antenna, the signal goes towards this direction and this direction. Broadside to the antenna, there's very little or no signal. So if we were to look at the diagram here, we'll see that's exactly what's happening, right? The antenna, the magnetic loop antenna, is transmitting all of its energies towards this end and this end. However, broadside it, you actually have a null, as they call it. So for the exam, you need to know that the radiation pattern is maximum in the plane of the loop, but broadside to the loop, they are nulls. And it's also a feature that you can use in reducing sources of interference. Remember we said that anytime you have a low signal point of an antenna, it's rejecting or it's not the main lobe, you can use that to your advantage if you're getting interference in one direction. You can point or turn the antenna around to notch out or reduce that interference using that property of the antenna. So just know that for the magnetic loop antenna, the radiation pattern is maximum in the plane of the loop, but you have nulls broadside to the loop. Another type of antenna, screwdriver antenna. No, that's not using a screwdriver as an antenna, but it's a type of antenna that uses a motorized type of function that allows the inductance of the antenna to vary. And with that adjustment, you are creating a multiband antenna that can tune to a particular frequency on various bands. So it's typically multiband, and you typically use it in a mobile setting or in your vehicle. It's a very popular type of antenna that can be used when you're mobile in your vehicle. Bit on the expensive side, the commercial ones. However, a brand that's very popular outside there, which you can look up, is the Tar Heel brand of motorized screwdriver antennas. So what you need to know for the exam is that a screwdriver antenna, it has a motorized tuning assembly and it varies the inductance of the baseload coil to adjust the feed point impedance. And that causes the antenna to be tuned to the desired operating frequency. Remember we said hams are matchmakers. We're always trying to tune that antenna for the frequency we're going to use. So we're a ham radio operator. We want to transmit mobile. I'm in Trinidad and Tobago. We have John that's in the US and I want to speak to him. But right now I'm on a particular frequency. He's on another frequency. I'm going to meet him. So I use that property of the antenna to tune it to that frequency that he is on. So I'll have a resonant antenna to be able to speak with him, have low SWR, maximum transmit. My radio will be very happy. And I'm tuning my antenna by adjusting that loading coil. It's actually a motor inside of the antenna that will move the coil up and down. And there's a switch inside of your vehicle that you can press up and down to lower the coil or raise the coil. You do also have other fancy switch boxes that could have a memory that will remember the position for 20 meters. It's here for 40 meters. It's higher up and so on. And you can press a button and your screwdriver antenna will adjust. It will go up and down like a plunger. It will increase and decrease. But what you're really doing here is changing the position of the tap on the coil. And that is what causes the antenna to be longer or shorter. And you're tuning it to the frequency, the wavelength of the frequency that you're going to operate on. And that's how the screwdriver antenna works. Yet another type of antenna is called the halo antenna. And yes, it does resemble a halo, so hence the name. But for the exam, you need to know about the radiation pattern. So a halo antenna consists of a half-wave dipole element that's bent into a loop. So here we have it. It's a half-wave antenna dipole, but we bend it into a little loop. And the radiation pattern is omnidirectional in the plane of the halo, and it is also horizontally polarized. So what do we mean by omnidirectional? Remember that it means in all directions in the plane of the, so it's 360. That's what omnidirectional mean, all directions. And notice that the signal is horizontally polarized. But for your exam, you need to know the radiation pattern is omnidirectional in the plane of the halo. So here we have a little construction diagram to show you, and then we have the vertical plane and the horizontal plane that shows you the radiation pattern for this antenna, should you wish to compare and contrast. Don't need to know it for the exam, but it can help you understand these terms when we say the radiation pattern is omnidirectional in the plane, and so on and so on. So just some extra information for you to have at your fingertips. So that was the end of the antennas and feedline topic, and we'll just quickly start we just have a couple of slides on the next topic, which is radio wave propagation, and we will end our session with that. So let's go. Couple of slides on radio wave propagation. The sunspot cycle. So did we know that the sun had a cycle? Yes, it does. It's called the sunspot cycle, and it occurs every 11 years. So anytime you hear about the sunspot cycle in amateur radio, it's that 11-year cycle that we're talking about. But what is that cycle about? What cycle is it? Well, what is a sunspot? So if we were to look in the middle of our screen here, this is a photograph that's taken of the sun. Now, please don't try this at home unless you, of course, have the requisite type of proper equipment and training. This is a photo of the sun that shows there are some darker areas on the surface or cooler areas, and those are called sunspots. So the sun goes through its cycle where at certain times there are a lot of sunspots, and other times there are less or lower number of sunspots. And there's a cycle, and that cycle is 11 years. And we have a little graph here showing since 1913 all the way to present time, the sunspot cycle. So notice low sunspot cycle, low number of sunspots. It goes up, goes up, goes up. It goes to a peak. Look at these number of sunspots here, over 200. And then it goes down to 100 and less. And it goes down and goes down and goes down. And then after about 11 years, it starts to go back up again. Go up, go up, go up. And then it starts to come down again. So this period here, it's approximately 11 years. So that's cycle, that sun goes through every 11 years. At the peak, you have a couple hundred sunspots, and at the ebb, well, you have much less than that. So that sunspot cycle is important to amateur radio operators. But note it's every 11 years, that cycle. And right now, we're at the start of the new cycle. We had a very, very low solar minimum, and propagation was really bad in the bands, but we are now starting to go up. So the number of sunspots is one of the main factors that affects amateur radio communications on the HF bands. That's why we are studying it. That's why we are concerned about it. Depending on the year of the sunspot cycle, you either have really good, excellent propagation, easy propagation where you could go onto your radio, turn your radio on, tune it to a frequency, and you are making long distance contact very, very, very easily. So the propagation is really good. Sometimes unity, sometimes, lots of propagation going on. And at other times when the sunspot cycle is on the low side, you will find you have difficulty in making those contacts. Signals are very, very weak, and therefore you may not be able to make those contacts as easily as you did. So you need to know where you are in this sunspot cycle. Are you at the low point, or are you at the middle, or are you at the high point? All right, so that's why it's important. The higher the number of sunspots, it generally indicates a greater probability of good propagation at HF. So once you have a high number of sunspots, that's your sign that you're probably going to be able to make contacts easier than if it were a low number of sunspots. So this you need to know for the exam. Higher the number of sunspots, greater probability of good propagation. A related topic is the solar flux index. So sometimes people talk about the number of sunspots, or they may talk about the SFI, or the solar flux index. And there's a relationship. So the SFI, the solar flux index, is another measure of the sun's activities. The solar radiation, and you need to know this for your exam, the solar radiation is actually measured at the 10.7 centimeter wavelength. That's what the exam question will ask you. And some persons, you may be wondering, okay, what frequency is that? Well, you could either calculate it yourself, you have the power to, you have the formula, or I could just let you know that's somewhere around 2.8 gigahertz. So when they're measuring solar radiation, those telescopes are looking and listening to the 10.7 centimeter wavelength. And we have a little diagram. You don't need to know this for the exam, but just some extra information. We have the same cycle, the 11-year cycle, showing the sunspot numbers, that's in red. And we have the solar flux index that is shown in blue. So some people think that the solar flux index is a more useful number than looking at the number of sunspots, right? So many hams will look at the solar flux index, not necessarily the quantity of sunspots, right? So, but there's a relationship, as you can see, and notice that the solar flux index, doesn't go much below 100, maybe 60, 80, somewhere there, and it goes up to about 300. But notice that the sunspots could go all the way down to a very, very low number and then go all the way up to about 300 and something as well. So there is a correlation and a relationship between the solar flux index and the number of sunspots. So as a ham, you might find yourself reading reports about solar flux index. Note that it's related, or there's a relationship between that and the number of sunspots. That's just FYI. Okay, so last slide before we close off for this evening. So I have a diagram here showing a typical chart that many hams look at and stare at. Apart from looking at propagation reports, this is something that hams look at regularly to see what the prediction is, what's the conditions on the various bands. And notice the solar flux index is there, sunspot number, all sorts of other values are given, and also the HF conditions for the various bands from 80 meters to 40 meters, 30 meters to 20 meters, 17 meters to 50 meters, 12 meters to 10 meters. And it'll tell you for the daytime what kind of conditions it is. Fair, kind of so-so, poor, oh boy, and then good, well, all right, time to do some DXing. So, or making contacts. So you can get some predictions based on these numbers that they calculate what your conditions are predicted to be. So we say that at any point in the solar cycle, the 20-meter band usually supports worldwide propagation during the daytime. So this is an exam question, and you need to know that. And if you were to look at the chart here, you notice here, during the daytime, yes, look at that. We have fair propagation. So that means we can talk, we can speak, we can send digital mode traffic and so on. We can communicate on 20 meters. And we also need to know that the 15, 12, and 10 meter bands are the least reliable for long distance or DX communications during low solar activity. So notice here 15, 12, and 10. So 15, 12, and 10, look at that here. Yeah, we kind of still relatively low in the cycle. We're not high. And notice, see the information is matching here. Poor. So notice that the theory kind of matches the actual conditions as predicted. So for your exam, know these 2 points. 20 meter at any point in the solar cycle usually supports worldwide propagation during the daylight hours. You can get some props. And for 15, 12, and 10 meters, those are the least reliable, least usable, most waste of time, if you want to put it that way, for long distance communication when you have low solar activity. So folks, that's it for this evening's session. And yes, okay, friends, you're saying that, yes, the range of the Sunspot cycle could be anywhere between 8 and 14 years, fair enough. And George, you're saying you see the spots with your telescope. I trust that you're using the Baden filters in doing so. Okay, yes, friends, and that's why we have amplifiers, right? So not operating QRP at all, right? So folks, thank you so much. Please continue to review any missed sessions that you have. Persons who are still now joining class, check out the technician class. It's foundational information. Just some information for REACT members in Trinidad and Tobago interested in vaccination. We sent the message out. Please contact your team president if you have not already gotten that message, if you're interested in vaccination. So the next session, folks, will be held on Friday, the 23rd of July, 2021 at 8:30 p.m. usual time. So thank you so much, everyone. Take good care and be safe. Okay, thanks a lot, Adesh. Have a good night as well. Be safe. Roger, you too have a good night. All the best. Paula, take good care. Good night. Gary as well, take good care. Sylvester, do have a good night. Okay, Adish, good night again. Thanks a lot for the encouragement, dear friends. Appreciate it. So you got the internet sorted out. Great show with the static IP there. Kevin, as well, you're certainly welcome. Do have a good night. Ron, great to have you in there, man. So you're certainly welcome. Certainly a pleasure. Please pass the greetings along to the XYL there too, friends. Will do understand. And we're looking forward to the day that we can travel again and, we could knock a glass and probably have a bite as well. Ramzan, good night as well. You too, take good care. Ian, you too, all the best. Charlene, all right, well, you can always catch up on the recording. Hopefully it will stick and will be circulated shortly. So you could always review. Thank you so much for the kind feedback there, Charlene. All the best. Jessica, do have a good night. Take good care as well. Okay, Arvin, bye. Good night to you as well. Okay, Charlene, have a good night. Take good care. All right, yes. Well, borders opening up, so once it's safe to do so, possible as well. So I guess we owe you a return visit there, France. So looking forward to it there. Yep. All right, so folks, be safe. Okay, Bob, take good care. All the best. Desi, good evening too. Have a good night, yeah. Okay, Jermaine, all the best. Did I miss anyone? Yeah, Natasha, good night as well. Okay, and John, always a pleasure. Okay, June, you too. Be safe.